Tali, it is such a pleasure to have you here. So thanks for joining.
My pleasure, Manolis, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much. So you've done some groundbreaking work on the perception of reality by humans. We are quite funny creatures. We tend to have this optimism bias that you've pointed out, and that affects very much our outlook. And I know how guilty I am of that. But at the same time, there's many dangers of that. So here's my question to you: how different are we from animals? Like when a monkey or a squirrel is setting off to jump from one tree to the next, are they expecting to fail? Is that
Um,
a uniquely human trait, or is
so
that
actually,
something that is common evolutionarily and something that dictates evolutionary fitness across many kingdoms of life?
yeah. So I think 2 points here. One about the uniqueness of humans, and the other thing about if it's good or if it's dangerous. I think overall it is good. But in terms of animals, actually, it's been suggested, and there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that non-human animals are also optimistically biased. So there's been studies, I can tell you about the paradigm. It's been done in almost every species. Common study is to teach an animal, let's say a bird, that if they press a lever on the right side, sorry, when they see a green light, they press the lever on the right side and then they get an immediate reward. So this is great, right? If they see a red lever, they have to press if they see a red light, they have to press a lever on the left and then they get a delayed reward. So not so good. They don't like to wait one around for their reward. And then they start showing them lights between green and red. Right? And what they see is that if the light is between green and red, they still press the lever, which will give them, they think will give them the immediate rewards. And they have to get it right, because if they don't get it right, they don't get anything at all. So they're incentivized to get it right. And then if you even go closer to the red, they would still continue to press the right lever, suggesting that they expect the immediate reward. And they're paying for it because they're making a mistake, so they get no reward at all. So these kind of experiments, it's not quite the same about optimism and optimism biases. We see it in humans, but these experiments have been done in a lot of different species with different modalities. And again, you see that the animals misperceive things as suggesting that a reward is coming, the best kind of reward, right? The immediate reward. So we do think that this is not a uniquely human trait. It's probably evolved, for quite a long time. And probably because on average, it's quite a good thing.
So my question to you is, if you look at humans, nobody would say that we're all optimists. I mean, sure, as a group, we tend to be, but many people define themselves as pessimists or realists, and some people define themselves as optimists. Are even the pessimists fooling themselves? Are they in fact optimists most of the time, but slightly biased towards normality?
Yeah, so how people define themselves is not necessarily what they are. So when you bring people into the lab and you test their expectations of what is about to happen in their life tomorrow in a year, you find people being optimistically biased on average in about 80% of the population, and regardless of how people define themselves to be. What I tend to think, and the data suggests this, that how you define yourself is about culture. So for example, in the US, people tend to define themselves as optimists. But for example, in the UK or in France, a lot of people would say they're pessimists or realists. So it's about what is considered to be the best thing to be in that culture, not actually what you are. There perhaps some kind of correlation, but a lot of times we have people coming in saying, I'm a realist, I'm a pessimist, and then we do the experiments and we see not so
So
much.
does knowing about your research change people's behavior? Do they somehow more consciously take decisions assuming optimism, or do they somehow start correcting themselves? Is there a behavioral change that results from us being more aware of this particular bias that we have?
Yeah, so the answer is yes and no. Um, Where the answer is yes, is that if you are aware of this, that means that you can plan ahead. And and you can think, okay, this is mostly a good thing for different reasons, but could also take me in the wrong direction. Maybe in investments, for example. There are other situations where you can think, probably this is not a good thing. In planning, so optimism causes people to think that things will take them less time than it actually does, and will cost them less than it actually does. So in those situations, if you know that, you can plan ahead, and you can put in policy in place, both in your life and in governments, in institutions. What it doesn't change is your perception. So knowing about this bias and any cognitive bias or visual bias, illusions and so on, doesn't make them go away, right? And there are great demonstrations of this when it comes to like visual perception and auditory illusions and go away. And the same thing is with cognitive bias. But if you do know about it, you can use it both to change, kind of put policy in place to change your own behavior despite your perception, and to help other people make better decisions.
Now, a lot of the bias that you have described has to do with the future, but there's been a lot of literature on biases both for the past and for the present. We basically tend to choose to believe things that are consistent with our worldview, and we tend to ignore evidence that would suggest that we're somehow wrong. Now, if you take this optimism bias, it basically says, if I choose X, I'm going to get a reward. And now when I'm looking into the future, I can look backwards and say, aha, I made the right choice, even though it was the wrong choice, because of this, bias for reaffirming our worldviews. I'm curious, how related are these two types of biases?
So if you mean, for example, confirmation bias, so confirmation bias is the idea that if I have a belief, let's say a political belief about gun control, I think gun control is good, and then I get evidence, and some of the evidence confirms my beliefs and some doesn't, I tend to take the evidence that confirms the belief, but disregard the evidence that doesn't. Kind of tell myself, oh, this is not really hello, good data, and so on. And sometimes you would say, well, the confirmation bias and the optimism bias will actually come head to head. For example, let's say you believe that you are highly likely to have cancer because your family had cancer and so on. So you have a strong belief, I'm going to get cancer. You go to the doctor, you have a genetic test, and the genetic test says, nope, you are actually quite immune to cancer. Are you going to change your belief? The answer is yes. So when you put the confirmation bias head to head with the optimism bias tends to win the confirmation bias. There's a wonderful study that was conducted in England was one where they asked people just before the presidential election, before the 2006 presidential election, who it was in August, so a few months before the election, who they wanted to win. So about half wanted Trump to win and half wanted Clinton to win. And then they asked them who you think is going to win. Most of the people thought that Clinton was going to win at the time. Even the Trump supporters believed that Clinton was going to win. And then they showed them a poll, and the poll suggested that Trump was going to win. And they asked them again, who do you think is going to win? How confident you are? And what they found was that people who wanted Trump to win quickly changed their belief and said, oh, Trump is going to win. And those that wanted Clinton to win said, well, I don't believe this poll. It's not a very good poll. So that's just another demonstration that when you take the optimism bias and confirmation bias, the optimism bias tends to win, but confirmation bias is hugely powerful in setting up a relief system as well.
Humans have also this weird thing that somehow we're looking for meaning. And we also like to think that we're unique in that. We'd like to think that perhaps animals don't look for meaning as much, that they're just following their instincts or following, programmed behaviors that, are making them fitter for survival. But then somehow humans' quest for meaning doesn't always make us fitter for survival. Sometimes it will lead people to depression, it will lead people to suicide, or to not have children, or to sort of somehow not spread their genes to the next generation. So my question is, how does this quest for meaning relate to these other cognitive biases that humans have? And can we somehow get some kind of meaning out of that, can we get something about how our brain even perceives meaning from understanding these biases?
Yeah. So it's a hard question to think about whether animals have meaning. Definitely not in the sense that we have, because we have a different type of consciousness. First of all, we are aware of our mortality. That is thought to be uniquely human, and that's quite an important. I think the relationship is this one, because what makes life worth living is the meaning that we put to life, and that meaning can be different from different people. Let's say the meaning for me is having some kind of productivity and love. And let's say at some point in my life, I don't have either, or I have only one. At that point, I can say, well, there's no meaning anymore, right? I don't have love. I'm not productive. It's not worth living. That's when optimism comes in, because it says, well, even if you don't have what you think makes life worth living, if you think that it's going to come in the future, that still means that life is worth living. And it's exactly when people lose optimism, when they lose hope, that's when they feel there's no longer meaning, and that's when they tend to, fall into depression, suicide.
That's kind of interesting. So in a way, this optimism bias and the quest for meaning is somehow related to each other. But there's another aspect, which is
Yeah,
suppose that the meaning for a person is to achieve the Nobel Prize. And then they get the Nobel Prize. Then they lose their meaning. So in a way, the quest for something should also be a quest for something unattainable, rather than something that you can quantify. Whereas, a quest for love and for success is vague enough that you can never quite say, okay, I'm done with love, got it, check.
yes.
So I'm curious about sort of the difference between abstract goals and concrete goals in our search for meaning.
So I think we have both. We have this abstract goal, right? And then we say, okay, this is my abstract goal. And so for now, my sub-concrete goals are these goals. But once I get these goals, what people tend to do is they tend to want the next thing. And perhaps, people think about that. It's like the hedonic treadmill, right? You get wealth, you get it, you want more. But perhaps that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because otherwise, if you got it all, as you say, well, what's left to do?
So greed in a way, and lack of satisfaction is maybe at the root of our quest for meaning. And if we are content, somehow the meaning might go away.
Yeah, that's a good point. So people tend to think that what humans are after is happiness, right? And then there's this whole literature about, well, if humans are after happiness, and they make all these decisions that don't in fact give them happiness, well, that means we're, stupid, we're irrational, suboptimal, and so on. But I tend to think that perhaps what we are after and the decisions that we make is not to maximize happiness at all. Perhaps, we do a lot of things to maximize happiness, but maybe that is not in fact the main driver to maximize happiness. Because often you would see that people will make absolutely conscious, aware decisions that they know will make them less happy, but it is for something else, right? That something else may be those abstract goals that would not necessarily make you happy at the moment, perhaps not in the long term, but are still worth it. So I think that these actions that people take that do not make them happy is not necessarily a mistake. It could be something that we mean to do, and we should probably do. Because if all humans were doing is trying to get happiness, I'm not sure that we would have survived very long, right? Looking now at climate change and so on, if all our actions would be just to get happiness for ourselves, or even for our species at the time, I'm not sure we would survive very long.
So can you give some examples of what you're describing? Basically, I like the concept, vaguely, but my question is, when you make it concrete, are these people explicitly saying, I will choose something that will make me less happy because I'm pursuing that other goal? Or are they subconsciously so driven by that goal that they will constantly make themselves miserable in pursuit of that goal without actually realizing that they could be much happier letting go of that goal and, just going to the beach or something?
I think it's a little bit of both. We believe that we're after happiness, but when you have a decision to make, you often realize, for example, you take a job that is going to be, prestigious and will get you, maybe you'll do, something important for the world, and you realize this is not going to make me happy. But there's no question, you're still going to do it, right? The same thing for love. Love doesn't always make you happy, and a lot of times people would say, well, even if it doesn't, and so I read a book recently by my colleague who actually, the whole book is about the mistakes that we make, right, to make us happy. And he starts the book with something like, if you had to choose for yourself to be happy for the rest of your life, but it's not very productive and not have a family or something like that. Or you could have a family, have a very productive job, but you are not going to be very happy. What would you choose, right? So you choose a latter. And so this is an extreme example, but you can have a lot of examples like that. And I think when you put it, one versus the other, happiness is not necessarily what we always choose. It's important, but it's perhaps not the ultimate goal. And so our decisions are perhaps not as stupid and irrational as we tend to look at them many times.
I always like to distinguish short-term happiness and long-term happiness, but perhaps we're just missing the vocabulary. Maybe one should be called fulfillment, the other one should be called, pleasure or something like that.
Yeah, or maybe we're driven by some survival instinct of ourselves and our species, right?
That's interesting that you put the species in there. So, a lot of people tend to think that survival is very egocentric, and genes basically are sort of somehow pushing for their own propagation rather than, caring about the species, let alone the individual. Actually, vice versa, the individual, let alone the species. So my question is, how do you see these forces of our brain working at the individual level versus at the societal level? I mean, very often there's, of course, a huge trade-off. I could do stuff that's good for me and, terrible for society, but somehow society has made it. So do you feel that these behaviors are selected at the individual level, as at the societal level, or somewhere in between?
It has to be both. I think if you had to write an algorithm, you would probably write one that would maximize both.
It's interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about the species, and we've talked a lot about humans, very broadly. You as a person, how are you affected by your own research? Have you found that sort of these realizations are sort of shaping your behavior? And if you were to answer the question, what is the meaning of your life? What would it be?
Yeah, so for the meaning of my life, I already, told you about that.
Love and success.
The meaning, well, I think meaning is having meaning, first of all. The meaning of life is a feeling that you have meaning. And for me, it's productivity and love. And I think that's probably true for a lot of other people as well. In terms of how my work has affected me, so I get that question a lot. And there's a huge confounding factor, which is when I started the research, I was much younger. So, it was, I would say 10 or 20 years ago. So anytime that I think about the changes that I've gone through, it's hard to disentangle them, whether it's age or is it my research, because let's take happiness, for example. So happiness changes quite systematically, which it starts quite high and then it goes down and it reaches your very, very bottom at your, but then it actually starts going up again. And there's a lot of things that change quite systematically throughout your life. Stress starts low, goes up, 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 it reaches a peak and then goes down. The way you learn, our research has shown that the way you learn from positive and negative information also changes systematically. Positive stays the same, but negative, your ability to learn from negative information goes up until midlife and then starts going down again. So it's hard to disentangle like what it is. Is it age? Is it learning about these things? Am I less optimistic than when I started? Definitely yes. But I think it's probably an age-related thing, and probably optimism will come back. Research suggests very, very soon.
All right, and now for a final question, where I'm so afraid that the answer will actually be 42. Not what is the meaning of life, but how do you define midlife?
Yes, that is midlife.
Oh no, that was the answer I was not looking for. Anyway, so much to look for then in my own behavior as I'm crossing this threshold.
Okay.
Well, Tali, I
Thank
look forward to
you.
seeing you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for doing this. Take care.